Hello, welcome everyone to our webinar series, Everything on the Table, Reimagining Our Global to Local Food Systems. So excited to have you all joining us today. If you're just now tuning in with us, we go ahead and ask you to open that chat and let us know where you're watching from. I'm Kristen Uhlenbrock. I'm the director at the Institute for Science and Policy, a project at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And we are really thrilled that you have joined us today for the third and final episode in our webinar series here. We could have not have done this without any of our great partners, so I want to take a moment just to recognize and thank them. The University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, including the Environmental Sustainability Initiative. A huge thank you to Kristen and Colin there, as well as CSU's new Spur campus and the International Agriculture Program. A thank you to Carrie and all of her teams and colleagues who helped put this together. So as I said, this is episode 3. If you missed any of the previous 2, we do have recordings of those available on our channel, and you can go watch those. We started this series talking about food and climate and took a really big picture view. We started talking about the global food system and how climate change is impacting production. And our second episode, we took that a little bit further in depth, and we looked at the interconnectedness of both food and climate as it impacts livelihoods, including migration around the globe. Today, we're going to bring this down very local here to our own backyards in Colorado, and we're going to talk about food and our food landscape here in Colorado. We're going to be talking about impacts and adaptation as we're looking at a changing climate, as well as how all of our local food system comes together and produce. We have some amazing producers, restaurateurs, and all kinds of great experts joining us today. So let me introduce our guests and turn this over to them. I'm thrilled and glad to be joined by Eugene Kelly as our moderator and our host for today. Eugene is a professor at Colorado State University. He'll be leading us through a discussion with a number of panelists. We have Matt Chandra, who is co-founder of Tocabe Restaurant, which specializes in contemporary American Indian cuisine. It is really good if you haven't been there. We also have Julie and John Ott joining us. They are part of a multi-generational family at James Ranch in Durango, Colorado, where they focus on regenerative and sustainable practices. We also have Nicole Rose Marino joining us. She is the executive director of the Southern Plains Land Trust, which she helped co-found. And Brad Udall, who is a senior water and climate research scientist and scholar at Colorado State University. So we have a really great lineup today. For our guests who are joining us, just a quick reminder, we do want you to stay engaged in today's conversation. So you can ask any questions of our panelists in the chat. You just go ahead and open that up. We've got eyes on that. If you're watching us not on the Zoom platform, or whether you're on our YouTube or Facebook, you can go ahead and ask questions into the comment feature. We'll work in some of these questions into the discussion to the best of our ability. And I give my little apologies here at the beginning, which is we often don't get to everyone's questions, but we do really love to see them, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So thank you for joining us. Let me turn this over to Eugene to kick us off on our discussion. Hi, Eugene.
Thank you, Kristen. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm honored to be here for the final panel of the fall semester. So anyway, we have a really great panel, diverse group of people. And I think Kristen did an excellent job highlighting the sorts of things that we talked about this fall, in particular the connection from local to global. And I think that's something we'll sort of address today. We have everything on the table. That's the title of the series, and so we want you to feel free to ask any questions, and we'll do our very best to get to the questions, also answer the questions, and anything we can't, we'll try to get to you at some point down the road. So anyway, we've had introductions of our distinguished panel, and so what I thought I would do is lead off with some questions just to sort of bring everybody back into their connection to Colorado agriculture and the environment. And so I think that when we start talking about these things, I want you to think more broadly about how we really do connect to the global system when we talk about what we're doing here locally. And that can be everything from the way we manage our energy, the way we manage our land, and the way we choose to use our water, which will be things I think that'll be coming to the surface today, no pun intended. Let me start off with Nicole. Nicole, tell me a bit about yourself and maybe share your connection to Colorado agriculture.
Absolutely, Gene, and thanks for having me. I'm happy to share information about the Southern Plains Land Trust and how we intersect with food systems and with climate. So we create and protect a network of shortgrass prairie preserves in the Southern Great Plains. And we do this in order to protect wild nature, to give native species a secure future. And so far, we've protected about 32,000 acres, most of which we own and manage ourselves. The largest one is Heartland Ranch, which the closest town would be Lamar. Get out a map. We're way out there. And it really is a good place to be preserving shortgrass prairie. Heartland Ranch is about 25,000 acres in size, almost 40 square miles, making it larger than several national parks and even a couple countries. And what's really special about Heartland Ranch, in addition to having really high quality shortgrass prairie with varied topography and just stunning biodiversity, is that we've brought back American bison. And we've brought them back not for human consumption, but to help recover them as a species, which is really important because there are about 500,000 bison in North America, which sounds like a lot, but you got to consider that over 90% of them are actually managed as livestock and not always with their genetics and their wildness and their ecological function in mind. And so that's where we and other managers of conservation bison herds come in. I think it's also important to talk about ecosystem services when you're talking about global food production. In our view, sustainable food systems should be paired with set-asides for nature, because nature preserves are really powerful in providing ecosystem services such as biodiversity preservation and carbon sequestration, which are both intertwined with the climate crisis. And our work also dovetails with calls for 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the Earth's marine and terrestrial ecosystems as a hedge against the extinction and climate crises. And we need to keep all of these things in mind when we're talking about human production, because that 30 by 30 is actually just an interim step to what scientists have been calling for years. Nature needs half to protect 50%, more than half or more of the Earth's ecosystems, so that life on Earth can continue, including human life. And so that's really where we fit in, is, as you mentioned, the sort of way we manage land, looking at Colorado as a whole, looking at the Great Plains as a whole. Only about 1% of the Great Plains has actually been preserved, and compare that with this call for at least 30% by 2030. And it makes you think we better get busy in establishing and enlarging preserves that are for ecosystem function. And just one more thing, since this is a CSU-led production, I want to compliment CSU and the Colorado Natural Heritage Program on the development of the Conservation Data Explorer. Codex is a vanguard approach to valuing ecosystem services, and they've come up with some amazing valuations, the annual return of protecting wild nature as it speaks to the climate crisis. Thank you.
That's great, Nicole. Thank you. And just for context for the viewers, that we're talking about the eastern portion of the state, the southeastern portion of the state, which was severely impacted by the Dust Bowl, and so it's a really critical area ecologically and both agriculturally. Let's jump over to Brad. Brad Udall, maybe tell us about yourself and the connection to Colorado agriculture.
Sure, Gene. So my wife jokes at my title, Senior Water and Climate Research Scientist and Scholar. She tells me only 3 of those words are really true. She says I work on water and climate, and unfortunately, I'm really senior. I've had the privilege now working at CSU since 2014, and I focus on how climate change is impacting the water resources in the American West, with a fine focus on the Colorado River. And I've authored a number of peer-reviewed publications that have looked at this current drought, which we now know is not just natural, that there's a large human component to it. In fact, about half of the 20% decline in flows in the Colorado River since 2000 are due to human impacts, due to warmer temperatures. I used to work at the other university, at the University of Colorado. I worked there for 10 years, and I really have enjoyed being at CSU because of its connection to the ag community. And I never really understood land grant institutions until I got to CSU, and it's been fabulous because I get to connect with the extension folks. I've had a deep connection with something called the USDA Climate Hub, which was started by Secretary Vilsack when he was in the Obama administration. And that hub is designed to get ag producers information about our ongoing climate changes and to make everybody smarter about how to deal with this. Nicole doesn't know this, but I actually used to run a land trust in Eagle County years ago, and I actually got some engagement with the ag community, with the ranching community during that time as well. So, and I've done climate change presentations at the farm show and done a bunch of other things with ag producers. And I'll tell you, man, they work hard. They face risks that most people don't appreciate. They have a lifestyle that they love, but a lot of them, don't take vacations. Things that most of us would sort of say, what do you mean you don't do that? They're really devoted and they work hard, and they deserve our appreciation and thanks for what they do.
Great. Well, thank you, Brad, for sharing that. Let's jump over to Julie and John Ott. Maybe share, your connection to agriculture, and tell us where you're speaking from too, so we can sort of get a geographic sense of where you guys are. Yeah.
Okay, we are in Durango, Colorado, just north of Durango, on your way to Silverton. And the story of our situation is that my parents came to this beautiful mountain valley in 1961, newlyweds, wanting to start a large family on land, didn't really know what they were doing. And eventually they had 5 children, and 4 of us are here on the ranch now, and my father. And we are all very, very committed to keeping the 400 acres in agriculture, regenerative agriculture. And so you can imagine there's been a lot of years of evolution of where we are today, including just getting all the siblings back. John and I were the first to come back 31 years ago. And so we were the ones that worked with my parents to determine that we wanted to keep the ranch in agriculture versus building a golf course. And that was on the table. Actually, it was far down the table, the golf course was. And then we were introduced right about that time when John and I came back, we were introduced to holistic management. And that changed everything. We went to a couple classes, and my dad, who was the patriarch for so many years and had all those hard decisions on his shoulders of how to keep the land and what to do, all of a sudden saw another format of how to make decisions with the entire team, including grandkids, spouses, certainly. And so that decision-making process is what changed everything for our family. And to this day, we have consistent family meetings, and we have a mission statement. We have a quality of life goal statement. And that is the most important part. The forms of production, how many animals are you going to run? What kind of industries are you going to do, whether it's dairy or pigs or chickens? That is not as important as the health of the families, the happiness of the people. And because we've learned, and we all know, that if people aren't happy, they're not doing their best. And so that is a big part of what we're doing here is relationship building and making sure that our families are functioning so that we can keep the land. So that I just wanted to point that out, because
that's great.
I think in these discussions, a lot of times that people part gets put to the side, and really nothing happens without it. So
Brad, you have a comment. It looks like you want to say something.
Oh, I was just welcoming somebody to our event that I didn't expect to see here.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so John and Julie, continue. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize.
That's okay. Did you have anything to add to that little history lesson there, John?
No, it's been an evolution, certainly, and hard work to get where we are today, but yeah, our connection goes deep here in Colorado.
That's a really great way to display it. I mean, you know, the concept of the environment has changed over years since I've been at CSU, and we now know it begins with the home, community, and family. So, you know, you're a real big part of the environment, right? So we need to sort of be able to address those. Absolutely.
And so that's kind of where that segues into where we are today.
Right.
In those 30 years that we've been working at this, my siblings came back with their families, and we all started making decisions about how we were going to support 5 families on this 400 acres.
Wow.
And that's when we started to talk about the forms of production, because we all knew we wanted to be on this property, living near each other, supporting each other. How are we going to do that? So present day, I'm just going to skip ahead.
Listen.
Huh?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
No, go ahead. Continue. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Present day, we have, like I said, of the 5 siblings, 4 are here. My other brother lives in Durango, so he's actually definitely a part of the big decisions that we make on the ranch. He's just not working in agricultural entity. And so we have grass-fed finished beef. We have a pastured pork program. We have laying hens. We have a small dairy. My brother makes amazing raw milk artisan cheese, and has a herd share program for liquid milk. And then most recently, we have a tree farm. We have orchards. We have a big garden. My sister runs a garden. Then most recently, we took what we were experimenting with a food cart 10 years ago. My sister started a little food cart just cooking burgers out of a grill that's, 3x3. And it got so popular that present day we have a year-round restaurant. And the same thing with the market. We had a walled-in carport as a market where we sold our products on property. We made a big decision there that we were going to try to sell on property versus sending it to natural food stores in the Durango area or outside of the Durango area, but which meant that we had to ask the public to come to us and make a drive 10 miles out of town to come to us and buy beef and pork and cheese and eggs. And so we did that on that little carport level for probably 15 to 18 years. And 2 years ago, we made a gigantic decision that we talked about for 4 years as a family, because it was such a big decision. But we have a 3,600 square foot building now that houses our restaurant and a market.
Right.
And the market is what I run, and my other sister runs the grill. And so we can talk more about the market. It's definitely a big passion of mine.
Okay.
And I'm hoping that we can swing that into this discussion of agriculture in Colorado, because I'm seeing some very exciting things able to support our local regenerative farmers through that market.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me jump down to Matt Chandra. Matt, maybe a bit about your connection to Colorado agriculture.
Yeah, definitely. Hi everyone, I'm Matt Chandra. I'm the co-founder of Tocabe, an American Indian eatery. We're a fast casual restaurant located in the Denver metro area that specializes in native and indigenous cuisine. My business partner, Ben Jacobs, is an enrolled member of the Osage Nation. We've brought in his family's recipes in, along with other recipes that we've learned from elders throughout the community, nationally, locally, and regionally, and have really been able to create a cornerstone within the Native and Indigenous community to bring access to Native and Indigenous cuisine. And so we have 2 locations, plus a food truck. And recently we launched our Indigenous Marketplace, which is really a centralized shopping place for people to have access to Indigenous foods and hopefully start to build their pantry and start to inform themselves and educate themselves about Indigenous ingredients and everything that they can have to offer. One of our big connections to Colorado is through the development of Indigenous food systems and creating an economic pathway for those food systems. Here in Colorado, we have Ute, Mountain Ute, and Southern Ute tribal nations here. And so, we're really working on building that connection and a pathway for their farm and ranch programs and the development of further agricultural systems within their sovereign nation, to then create, have a platform to be able to sell their goods into the restaurant and along within our marketplace. So we're really focusing on connecting Native and Indigenous food systems to every household to have access to foods that nourish communities from seed to soul, as we like to say.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. That's great, Matt. Thanks. Okay, so Nicole, let's go back to you. So give me a bit about some of the threats you see from climate change, or things that you're facing in terms of the your location geographically and what you're doing with the land.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned the Dust Bowl earlier, Gene. I can't believe I didn't. That's something that definitely is always on my mind. That was certainly, it should have been a hard lesson for this country on what happens when we fundamentally alter ancient grasslands. And so, the Dust Bowl was caused by both conversion of grassland to crop, and also improper livestock grazing. It really took its toll during the 1930s decadal drought. But it happened again. It happened in the 50s and the 70s, the 90s, and we're back in the drought. And so I think the key lesson is the importance of, as my rancher neighbors would say, keeping the grass the right side up, of preserving the grasslands that remain. Luckily, in the shortgrass prairie, about half remains. So we have a really good opportunity to avoid grassland conversion. And we do that as a matter of course, and we're also enrolled in the carbon market to generate carbon dollars to sequester more carbon on additional grasslands that we buy. And so really, I think the most crucial issue is preserving native ecosystems. That's what's called the natural climate solution. It's certainly come up in the meetings in Glasgow, and it's just crucial that we really preserve what's left, not only of grasslands, but forests and mangroves, and a long list of these key native ecosystems that are providing, like I was mentioning earlier, a situation securing life on Earth, including for people. So I think that's one part of it, really preserving what's left, but also restoring what's missing or what might have been degraded. And so, for instance, I mentioned bison, and I think bison are just at the crux of Great Plains grassland restoration efforts, or at least they should be, because they safeguard ancient grasslands. They mow down all manner of shrubs and trees, and really are out there every day working hard to preserve grasslands, in addition to being incredibly charismatic and important for other native species. But another example is riparian restoration. And we've had a multi-year program to bring back degraded prairie streams by planting willows and cottonwoods that should be in the system but are missing, slowing down a flashy stream system with erosion control, and also providing the best environment for beaver to come back. Because like bison on the uplands, beaver in riparian areas work really hard to really shore up the resilience of our Western waterways to climate change impacts.
Right. Now, Nicole, so maybe just explain what riparian means. Maybe some people are not familiar with that term. You want to, just quickly.
Sure. It really just streams. A better word for it would be stream restoration. It includes, stream banks, the water channel, and really that whole system. And it's crucial for Western wildlife. The majority of Western wildlife depend on streams in these arid and semi-arid areas in the West, and yet they only make up a small percentage, like 1% of the landscape, but they're crucial to protect. So
that's
just
right.
restoration.
Those are those buffers along the waterways, and they call them biological buffers, right? They possess a lot of the biodiversity that we see around those little strips, So really interesting. Well, why don't we go over to water? So Brad, maybe tell us a bit about I know you have an enormous amount of work on climate change. Maybe share the sort of the potential impacts and challenges for agriculture moving ahead.
So climate change is water change effectively. I mean, I've been saying this for years.
Mhm.
If you warm the planet and you warm the poles at a rate that's 2 to 3 times as elsewhere, you change that equator to polar gradient, which drives our weather system. So there are areas that are going to get wetter, areas that are going to get drier. Unfortunately, this whole state is likely in an area that's going to get drier. And this current drought that we've got underway, probably we shouldn't call it a drought. It's 22 years in the Colorado River and ongoing. Climate scientists are starting to use the term aridification, the long-term warming and drying. And so not every year is going to be warmer and drier than the previous one, but that's certainly the trend. We're seeing declining snowpacks. We're seeing runoff that occurs 2 to 4 weeks earlier, more rain and less snow, higher temperatures, obviously, including in places in the Colorado River Basin over 2 Celsius, so close to 4 Fahrenheit if you're out in Grand Junction. The springs are warming especially quickly in places. We're seeing drier soils, obviously severe fires that those of us in the Front Range have got to experience the bad air quality that comes out of it. And we think storm tracks are moving northward. That helps make this state more arid, shorter winters, and even this notion of mega drought. So all kinds of challenges are embedded in what I just said. A lot of it comes down to using the water resources we have as wisely as we possibly can. And again, some years will be okay and some years not so good. And I also say within this state, you see really specific regional differences. So at times, the Northeast corner has actually done okay over the last 20 years, but the Southwest is not. And that's a worry that I've had for a very long time, that the Southwest Four Corners area will dry out and warm up proportionately more than elsewhere. There are really good climatological reasons to think that this should occur, and in fact, we are seeing it. And in fact, I recently did a little, quick and dirty look at the San Juan River. It's down not 20% like the Colorado River as a whole, but 30%.
Wow.
And if you're on the Dolores, for example, it had a really not great year this year. So, there are tons of challenges out there. We do have some tools, and so not all hope is lost, but boy, we're going to get to rethink a lot of things.
All right, thanks. John and Julie, just maybe some comments about the impacts of climate change or things that you're seeing in your land and in your operation.
And Brad's points are so well taken. What we focus on is how are we engaging in the water cycle? Mm-hmm. And so the big thing is to slow things down, and so capturing water, avoiding runoff, so no impermeable surfaces, no bare ground, all those are huge factors, and there's a lot of evidence of ranchers and farmers in our area and in North America where that's an effective tool. If you can avoid letting water run off and use it to its best potential, you build resilience. And so that's a giant step. And so we've focused on that in the last 35 years to try and sequester carbon in our soils so that they do hold water more effectively. And so it just kind of slows down the whole thing. Brad's point about the runoff being earlier and earlier, it's concerning for sure for us, because a lot of our water is through irrigation. And so we need to figure out how to best use it. And we've also been schooled over and over again that you just have to assume whatever you're doing in the natural biological environment, what you're doing is wrong. And so you have to monitor and look for those warning signs and act, because it's crucial to be humble when you're dealing with natural environments.
Right. Okay. And finally, Matt, I'll just sort of turn to you. You're sort of, at the other end of the supply chain. I'm just curious in terms of, the sort of the threats or sort of, are there real impacts of climate change on just sort of your connections and your business and things?
Yeah, definitely. They're significant, as everyone already illustrated before me here today. everything that was mentioned and things that we didn't get to, really affect the safety, security, and access to foods. And so that's something that is a huge concern. I think, with temperatures rising, soil erosion, crop variety is going to have to change. And that's going to affect how restaurants plan their menus, right? How we as consumers of food is going to just change, right, in our daily life. And our eating habits and patterns are going to be really different. And so, the concern for us, within the Native and Indigenous community is, what's the security and sovereignty of those food systems look like if there's not access to water rights, if we don't have the technical resources within the communities to help combat and further accelerate the ability to change on the fly. And so, those are just, some of the main immediate concerns that, tribal members and community members have relayed to us about what they see on the ground.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I think we'll do it. We're getting tons of questions, so I think I'm going to sort of roll through some of those, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible and make this a sort of get some of the audience is chomping at the bit in terms of trying to get some questions in on you guys. So I'll pull off a few right now that are just sort of general off the top, and then we'll go back to finishing up some other comments from the community. One of them is here's an interesting one. What is done with the waste farmers produce and growers experience? And is there a way for organizations that feed school children, et cetera, to effectively plug into that chain? So that we're talking about food waste. And I was wondering if maybe, I guess, John and Julie could probably comment on that, or even Matt, in terms of what, are these things that you worry about in your businesses and your operations? And, are there things that you guys can do to address some of those things?
Well, that's a great question. And you always look for opportunity when you're in agriculture. And from the get-go, we've worked with a lot of microbreweries in Durango. We get their spent grain to feed our pigs and chickens. We get food scraps, kitchen waste, not food waste, but actual kitchen scraps from, gosh, I don't know, we're working with 5 or 6 restaurants in Durango now, where we use that for our chickens and pigs. And so it's a giant issue. And so we're doing what we can to engage how we, what makes sense for the restaurants. And recently there's a new, what's it called? Farm to compost or
Table to compost.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's a new composting business here in Durango, and they are signing people up like crazy and composting household food waste. So it's and then that goes back into farms, and it's great.
I'd also like to point out that in our restaurant and in the market, but mostly in the restaurant, we are buying really high quality food from the local farmers and expensive. For us to go to a poultry producer in Durango and buy their chicken is 3 times the amount of money that it costs to get it, even if it's organic.
Yeah.
It's incredibly more expensive to buy pumpkins and chicken and all these things that we are buying and selling in our restaurant. And Matt probably can attest to this too. So once you make that kind of final financial commitment, you are going to use every little bit. There is no waste. My sister's buckets that go to the chicken are very small. Everything's used to make broths, and the skins of the pumpkins become, I don't know what she does. She works really hard to make sure that she gets every little penny out of her investment.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that, the earlier discussions about food waste, if, this is really a global issue, and there are different levers, right? And in the less economically developed parts of the world, waste is at the field level. Of course, in the developing world, it's usually at the table and at the restaurant, right? So there are sort of different ends of the spectrum in terms of food waste. And there was some number of like reducing food waste by 15% could feed like 20 million people or something like that. I mean, it's sort of incredible, which would have let us produce less food if you if you think about it. Matt, what about in your shop? Like what are the sort of issues you have with waste and you have to deal with as a business person?
Yeah, definitely. Specifically, waste with food, we're very conscious on making sure we order correctly is one, but which is hard. If we do foresee trying to just plan, if we do foresee maybe we're not utilizing the lettuce in a rate that the shelf life is going to diminish drastically, partnering with organizations like Project Angel Heart and getting our food to them, and other food organizations that take what would be considered ugly food that couldn't be in the commercialized grocery store system, right? And then being able to distribute it to the communities that need it. Another thing from a waste standpoint that we would like to see is being able to recycle our gray water, right? I mean, we try to use a lot of high energy efficient appliances, but like our dishwasher, I mean, that water can easily be used to flush toilets, right? So reducing those barriers that we can recycle appropriate gray water and put it into appropriate uses would really help reduce our impact, that we have within the system.
Right. Yeah, we have the question on here, why haven't we hedged against climate change, at least with increased water storage in Colorado? Brad, maybe that's one of the questions from the audience in terms of, maybe comment on that and maybe give some perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, so great and appropriate question, but really difficult to answer, I think. We in the 20th century basically picked a lot of great reservoir sites. We built reservoirs there, and a lot of the really good sites are gone. In so doing, we created a whole host of problems, right? Environmental problems below dams. Dams, have a whole series of issues related to them, although they also have great benefits. In a state where you've got declining material, that is to say, rain and snow coming from the sky, additional reservoirs may in fact turn out to not be very helpful at all, and they might be expensive and empty most of the time. So nowadays, most of the 21st century solutions around water talk about, new, smarter ways of using water and conservation and land-based solutions like beavers that Nicole mentioned earlier. There may be places where new reservoirs make sense, but there are a lot of reservoirs in the U.S. and a lot in Colorado. And I'll tell you, they get really controversial quickly. I've fought some of those battles. And there are negatives around them. So proving that a reservoir in the 21st century is actually going to pay for itself is a complete challenge right now because of what we see with precipitation trends here in this state. And so I'm not saying no to all reservoirs. I'm just saying they're probably more like a 20th century solution and not a 21st century solution.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a good point. And then, so Brad, and then you hear these numbers that agriculture uses 70% of the water. So what does that really mean when they say agriculture uses 70% of the water? Is that just irrigation, or what does that all mean when somebody says that number to you?
So, I mean, so let's be really careful about use, right? Because people use that term very loosely. There are two types of water use. So one is a consumptive use of water and one is a non-consumptive use. Non-consumptive uses are typically what happens in a household. You use it and it goes back to the sewage treatment plant and ends up in the stream again. Somebody else can use it. Consumptive uses actually turn that water back into water vapor that's no longer usable. So plants use water through transpiration. If you water your grass, that water, turns into water vapor effectively. Most of that water, believe it or not, gets used to cool plants. A little bit of it gets turned into split off into hydrogen that joined with carbon that builds biomass.
Right.
So 70% of the water, typically that's a consumptive use number in this state, and the remaining 30% is either used by municipalities or by industrial purposes or through evaporation. Reservoirs actually in places evaporate quite a bit of water. So and we shouldn't be surprised. This is the number that occurs worldwide in basically arid areas. There's far more land than there is water in arid areas. Arid areas can actually be great places to grow stuff because there's great sunshine all the time. And so effectively, historically, all the water that wasn't being used by municipalities got put to use in ag. And that's why you have such a big number like that.
Great. Okay. Let's go down. We have a couple more questions here. Oh, here's a one. This will be for our producers here. In the climate crisis conversations, why is animal agriculture very rarely talked about? Data shows that animal agriculture is number one producer of greenhouse gases. And if we eliminate animal agriculture, we'll reduce land ag use by 73% in the United States. What's being done to lessen the impacts of animals? And so maybe start with Nicole. I mean, I'll start there and then we'll go across to Julie and John. So obviously, Nicole, we understand. Well, I mean, we've shared that your operation is not really about consumptive use of animals. It's more about a broader impact, but maybe you have some thoughts about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And I actually just a brief comment on food waste. When our animals pass away, their bodies go back into the system. And so through a human lens, that might seem wasteful, but it's really important for the ecosystem and just has a cascade effect for scavengers like, coyotes and swiftfox and ravens and vultures, all the way down to carrion beetles. So that's really important to acknowledge that not all food waste is wasteful. But I think on the issue of animal agriculture and its contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, I think one way to look at this is by really being mindful of our impacts as an operation. And so through our enrollment in the Climate Action Reserve's grassland protocol, we actually pay for our own carbon footprint, i.e. the methane emission of those bison, before we are able to participate in that market at all. And I would love to see a model where animal ag producers and all, producers of, whether it's produce or whether it's animal products, really do integrate the footprint into our own, budgets, so we can make sure that we are actually moving the needle forward on climate change. It's going to take all hands on deck. We're happy that we do that at the Southern Plains Land Trusts, and I think more and more producers are getting involved in the carbon market, and so that equation is really built into most good programs.
Okay, Julie and John, you guys you obviously have animals as a part. Well, you have a highly integrated system, but your animals are a key part of your system. Maybe talk a little bit about how you manage animals and, in terms of I think you used the word regenerative at one point. I was just curious about what were you communicating there? Yeah.
Well, it's a huge topic, and we've chosen to be involved in animal agriculture in a way that we're regenerating the soil. We're reversing climate change with our practices. And so it's a real opportunity for the public, and Matt's, I'm sure, on board with this, that we need to educate our community customers as to what they're getting. There's a lot of outfits out there like American Grass Fed Association and the Quivira Coalition and Holistic Management International and Savory Institute have a lot of good information about how animal agriculture can reverse the effects of climate change. And the industrial agriculture that's prevalent is a big part of the problem. And that's where those scary numbers come from.
Right. Yeah. So
she's dealing with a regenerative question constantly. So maybe you can talk about that.
Well, if you think about how nature works, the earth was created with animals on it. And if you are not going to synthetically fertilize a crop, then you need to fertilize it with something else. And to think about an integrated ecosystem where you are managing your animals so that they are your fertilizer, and you don't have any impacts on there besides what nature does, naturally, then it is incredible to watch it happen. I mean, the proof of this has been proven a lot. So any kind of research into that is exciting. The other point that I know I learned, there's a TED talk that Alan Savory did a while back that rocked the world. And he points out on there, and I'm not sure if my percentages are right, but something like 95% of the land on Earth cannot be cropped. I mean, you can't farm it. It's too steep, it's too rocky, but you could run a herd of goats up in that land and do what Nicole is witnessing with her bison and use that animal impact to improve that grassland. Don't let them camp out there and overgraze those plants, but manage that herd. And then you get this incredible diversity of grasslands that is native to that area. And you get a protein that doesn't need much to sustain really healthy people. So it's exciting to see if we can just do what nature does,
Right.
and do it well, and maybe keep portion sizes down
Right.
in our diets,
Right.
and not have to have a burger every meal, or just let's just pay attention.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a really great question, the person who asked this question. And I think, that it's very clear that the numbers show that this is a part of the agricultural system where there can be improvement and efficiencies. And I think what you're talking about are sort of really looking into, I think at CSU, we're really sort of taking a hard look at sort of being able to, get animals back on the land and create efficiencies in operations and the use of water. And of course, we're all concerned now about methane production and the generation of CO2. So, the push to have agriculture move to a zero carbon footprint, the livestock industry is an area where that, potentially has huge benefits if that could be done. Matt, there's a question here I thought I would just throw in. So somebody said, are there food choices we could be making in terms of our impacts on climate change? I was wondering if you guys in your business talk about that, or do you have, sort of preferences and maybe share a bit of that with us?
Yeah, definitely. I think, like anytime, let's from a restaurateur, right? Where it's a complex, right? So you have to, at the same time, you walk this fine line of you have a business and you also are trying to be responsible, right? And so as Americans, we eat too big portion size, right? So, and we choose to a lot of times get our animal protein from a commodity side of things and not looking at our local ranchers and local farmers, right? So we keep on feeding into the feedlot mentality. So, looking from a diet side of things is really center of the plate being vegetables and produce, right? And then looking at responsibly regeneratively raised animals from an animal protein side, right? And so just really trying to shift that conversation, right? And then it's a huge consumer education piece of it, of, when you're trying to make that shift over of how to reduce your portion size, right? And be more responsible. And it's about quality over quantity, right? About that meal and the memories and the impact it creates over just having to be overly stuffed and full, right? So it's that balance, and it's a complexity when you get to, being a restaurateur, and how do you manage that all.
Right. There's some more water questions here. Hang on a second. Brad, here's one that I think you sort of keep up on most of the stuff. It says, now that there is sensor technology using artificial intelligence, can it be used to help reduce water use and improve crop quantity? So something about technology now, Brad, in terms of on our landscapes and in our water systems, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just say I appreciated the sensitivity around that discussion about animal ag.
Yeah, me too.
all these discussions around climate change, it's got to be done respectfully. We're talking about people's livelihoods. Mm-hmm. Nobody got in this to be a bad person.
Right.
And we need to figure out, how to move forward and have discussions like this about it.
Right. Right.
Ranchers are hardworking folks. So let's just, yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, that's a really important thing. I mean, you know, that I had an experience with a colleague of mine, John Foley, and we were sitting across the table from people that were sort of anti-animal agriculture, and I'm sitting there with the Livestock Association on my left, and I look across the table and say, hey, look, nobody here is going away. We just need to really figure out how to work together, and we know that we can solve these problems. They're not impossible to solve. And so I think you're right. I think being sensitive to the needs of everybody, we're all working at this together. And I think that's kind of what's great about agriculture, is that everybody's at the table, and everybody from Matt to Nicole, we're all trying to contribute to a sustainable, resilient system. And it's challenging now. So, you know, so with this thing about technology, I mean, with the efficiencies and stuff, what do you see coming down the road? I mean, what are the kinds of things you could envision? Yeah.
So there's cool technology out there. Some of it's really expensive. I'll say that. There are lots of ways that save water, at least apparently save water, that may not save water. So, you know, things that we think about, like high efficiency irrigation techniques, drip sprinklers. There are certain ways to flood irrigate that's actually more efficient than just running water over fields kind of indiscriminately. There's timing that can be done. This all can save water, but you really need to be careful about it, because what has happened historically, believe it or not, is that many water efficient techniques actually lead to more water use. I know it's kind of hard to believe that, but water efficiency techniques oftentimes remove two constraints to water use, one human and one plant. So let me explain this. So if you put in like a beautiful drip system, every plant is going to get the right amount of water. Whereas, you know, in an old flood irrigation system, you probably overwater the top end of your field and underwater, so the plants aren't completely happy. So you got an efficiency there that allows for greater water use under the new technology. And the other thing is, most of these systems, you flip a switch if you need more water. Whereas under an old flood irrigation, guess what? You had to get out there with your wading boots on, and there's a labor constraint on it. So what we've learned in Colorado here is, by all means, pursue these efficiency techniques, but our state engineer is really eagle-eyed to make sure that they aren't an excuse or way for people to actually end up increasing their water use. And I mean, drones, and I mean, there's all kinds of great technology out there being used to figure out consumptive use and crop water requirements and the like, and they can be used. They're expensive, and oftentimes, I mean, you talk to ag producers around the state, it's a difficult business to be in, and oftentimes they don't have the funds to buy new technology.
Right. Let me cross over to Nicole. Nicole, you know, we're sort of talking about water, and I think perhaps your perspective on water is a little different. I mean, you're managing natural lands and you have animals, and maybe you can share a bit about, you know, how you sort of manage your water, the green water that's in the soil and stuff like that. Maybe share a bit about, you know, how maybe you can adjust or you can't, or what are the challenges in adjusting your operation to, you know, for these, you know, the certification of our planet.
Yeah, so actually our water use and the use of new technologies dovetails in that we have remote cameras set up on many of our stock tanks so that we can make sure everything's going okay. And if there's excessive, you know, if the water's overflowing the tank, we can make adjustments as necessary. So we certainly do that. And it also has the added benefit of we don't have to drive out to check on the tank as often. So we reduce our fossil fuel use, and we also reduce the disturbance to wildlife. We have elk coming back on our preserve. You know, elk were a grassland animal. They were pretty much hunted out in the early 1900s and fled to the forest, but they really do belong on the Great Plains. And they're the one species where if we limit our travel to a certain area of Heartland Ranch in particular, which is again almost 40 square miles, you know, it's really good to make sure there are pockets of it where there's low human disturbance, so those elk have that sanctuary and can bounce back. Right. But on the bigger picture of water on our property, I would say that, you know, as we work to expand Heartland Ranch to 43,000 acres in the next year or two, it will cover, it will include 57 stream miles
Wow.
that flow to the Arkansas River. And the Arkansas River is the largest watershed by area in the state. And so we can really have a meaningful impact on watershed health just through improved stream restoration activities. I think collectively across that much area, we can really be making a difference for wildlife, for the river itself, and for downstream users.
Yeah, and the water question in soil is always the big thing, right? Because if there was a number like if you took all the land area and you squeezed all the water out of it, there'd be enough water. There'd be more water flowing out of that than all the streams in the world. So there are these connections about this green water that is in the land, but we know that that's changing. That's really sort of shifting over long periods of time. John and Julie, I mean, go ahead, Nicole. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, I totally want to hear what Julie and John have to say about this, but I will add. I will add just that the other piece of that you reminded me of, Gene, is that when you look at how the streams are doing, the first place to analyze is really upland, what's happening above the stream.
Right.
And so with our very light stocking rates of bison and our mindful approach of making sure those upland grassland communities come back, we're really doing the lion's share of the work to help that stream recharge and recover with herbaceous vegetation on the stream banks, as well as those tree plantings I mentioned and erosion control I mentioned before.
Right, and John and Julie, I was going to sort of go to you. I mean, I know you live you're up in the hills, and the water issues there are different than what we're seeing probably in the Colorado River Basin, where Brad's been working and where Nicole is. But what about temperatures? Are you seeing any differences? And and anything that you're sort of aware of is in terms of growing season days or things like that, or if there are things in terms of water that that you're really concerned about in terms of maybe not quantity but quality of water. Yeah.
Well, that's a great question, Gene. We are seeing, it definitely is warming. I grew up. I'm a native to Mancos actually, and Julie's tapped into a young farmer network over there that are just so resilient and work so hard and are figuring out how to manage. They're not so much meat producers as vegetable producers, and so they're figuring out different varieties, different irrigation techniques, cover crops, ground cover, and all the pieces so that they adapt. And so we have just an amazing young group of farmers around here that are figuring all that out. And I know the Ute Mountain Utes with they're in a really tough spot down there with their irrigation. Now they have the McPhee Dam, so it's a lot of their land now is under irrigation that wasn't before, and they're figuring out how to be more effective with their irrigation. And there's big questions about water quality. That's a whole other subject, but it's really encouraging to me to see how farmers adapt to temperature and water availability. It's hard, but there's a lot of great people out there figuring it out.
Another example would be the San Luis Valley with Rocky Farms. You guys heard of him? Rocky is kind of
Brendan,
famous.
Yeah.
He's done some amazing things with cover crops and keeping that water cycle present. I mean, they're having trouble with their aquifer in that whole valley, and he just did an about face and said, we got to do this different. And he's been proving it year after year, and that's where we get all of our potatoes for our grill. We do a fried fingerling potato, and I think thousands of pounds of potatoes are coming from that farm all the way over here to Durango.
Here we go. So what happens on these panels, just to warn you guys, is that we start having celebrity panelists. And so now there are questions coming in directly from Matt. So I'm just going to go ahead and go right to Matt on this question. It says, Matt, are there any recommendation on food sources for buying bulk for school districts for Colorado grains, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I
I
would
didn't
look
mean
at.
to embarrass you.
Yeah,
I
no,
just-
no, you didn't embarrass me. That's fine. I'm no celebrity. I'm no different than anyone else. I would look at the Colorado grain chain from an opportunity to see local grain producers here throughout our state. It's basically a coalition group that you can tap into the system and look at all the different producers there and seeing. The hard thing with sometimes school systems is schools want to take products in from local farmers, but there's regulations and red tapes that just create barriers where it becomes problematic. But there's a lot of farmers, a lot of ranchers that would love to get their products into our school systems. But Colorado grain chain specifically for grains is a good one to start with.
Great. Okay, so now I'll just there are a couple of questions that are sort of offline, and I'll try. Brad, do you have any idea how much irrigated land we have in Colorado?
It's almost all of Colorado, with the exception of part of the Great Plains way east, right? There's dryland farming,
Yeah.
but almost everything everywhere else is irrigated, and it's just the nature of the aridity in this state.
Yeah, and so I just pulled some numbers up. So just for that individual, so that total of Colorado of about 67 million acres for the state, and 33 million of that is for agriculture. So that it's almost half of the state, some form of agriculture, and that's divided up between dry lands on the east, irrigated, right, managed pastures, and then woodlands, of course. But the largest chunk of that is rangelands, about 24 million acres in rangelands. You have that, Brad?
Well, I guess what I should say, I mean, your figures point out just how much dry land there is.
Yeah.
The valuable ag, in terms of dollar receipts, comes out of the irrigated portion of the state. It doesn't come from the dry land portion, just because those returns are much less because of the water. People do make living on them, but you're farming vast, dry land winter wheat stuff.
Right, and again, the issue gets back to the land that's feeding livestock, right? They're growing corn and all sorts, and alfalfa hay, and so there's an enormous amount of interest in that in terms of the overall land use in Colorado. Let me go back to a couple of other questions in terms of if we get more specific now. Let's go back to Nicole. I mean, some of the stuff that you're having to worry about is this carbon stuff. I mean, you've mentioned that several times. Tell me what what are you doing in your operation to sort of maybe explain to everybody, what you're trying to do, and then maybe what you're able to do based under, your constraints, and what are the needs you have in that area?
Yeah, so we are creating shortgrass prairie preserves and prohibiting cultivation permanently on our preserves. We partner with Colorado Open Lands, who holds a conservation easement that is highly restrictive and includes a restriction on cultivation. We at the Southern Plains Land Trust own and manage the land also in perpetuity. So it's a sort of belt and suspenders approach to shortgrass prairie preservation. But what that prohibition on cultivation allows us to do is enroll in the carbon market, and specifically avoided grassland conversion, that we make this pledge that's enforceable by that conservation easement, as well as contracts with the Climate Action Reserve, that we will never plow that ground. And that is really important for avoiding the potential emissions of these native grasslands if they were ever plowed up. So it's called an avoided conversion protocol. And again, that natural climate solution of just preserving the existing natural environment or habitat in order to avoid more emissions. But what we are doing is building on that in a couple ways. One is every carbon dollar that we generate, we allocate to acquire more grasslands to sequester more carbon, which creates this delightful feedback loop where we're really moving the ball forward in terms of the climate crisis. And we also have, a sustained and intentional effort to put dollars into the local economy. So we are helping to revitalize really a struggling southeastern Colorado economy. The poverty rate's 3 times the state average. So we're doing a lot of good in that regard. But in terms of the carbon, I think it's important to have the yin and the yang, to both avoid making the situation worse and trying to make the situation better. And
Right.
so by avoiding any current or future plowing of that grassland, we're avoiding making the situation worse by emitting the carbon that's being sequestered by these grasslands, which is not insignificant. It's about 15,000 tons per year. But we're also trying to make the situation better through the ecological restoration approaches that I mentioned earlier. And I think especially promising this idea of the streamside restoration, which may be creating these mini carbon banks all along those dozens of miles of streams. So I think climate change efforts really need to have that dual approach of reducing carbon emissions, but also avoiding future carbon emissions.
Right, right. John and Julie, some of the challenges, with your operation in terms of, what are the things what are your needs now, and what do you see as some of the challenges to meeting those needs? And in terms of either you have the production end of things, you also have the commercial end of things in terms of your restaurant and your food store. And so I was just wondering, what are some of the major challenges you're seeing, and in terms of anything with agriculture? What the climate change, or even the economic struggles we have, or transportation, or what?
Well, it's interesting. This last couple of years, it was very amazing timing to have our building done in the fall of 2019, in time for this pandemic to strike us, and we were the safe place to come and get good food in the area. And so we've always, since the new building's been built, we are kind of an oasis of people who know they can come and trust us to provide them with good quality meat and vegetables and all. But so that's been a strain on the production end of things, because we can't keep producing this. We need to get more tons of beef per acre figured out on our ranch, and then look outside of our ranch to other producers. And so we're partnering with other ranchers in the area. There's a program through the Savory Institute where they have an ecological outcome verification. And so we're going to them because they are coming up with a real certification that means something, where you're improving ecology. And so we're working with them and their for-profit ranching side to supply more beef for us. Right. Julie's into things with her market. You tell them what you've done; it's amazing.
Well, I did want to piggyback on what John was saying, that from our little farm and ranch perspective, production has been stressed hard. The restaurant has gotten pretty popular, and so my brother, who makes the cheese for the burgers, is strapped. We're working really hard to keep up, because we're not going to get somebody else's cheese for that. It's a James Ranch burger with James Ranch beef and James Ranch cheese, and so we're having to. That's a good challenge to have, but when you're working with living systems, you don't just go somewhere and buy more cheese. It's a 2-year-old animal that it has to be old enough to be milked significantly, and then that cheese has to age at least 3 months to have it be a raw milk cheese legally to sell to the public. So you're looking way ahead at production, and in the beef business as well. Those animals have to be 2 years old. They dry age for 21 days. So that's a complication of just production. But like I said, we're grateful to have that challenge. And because of that challenge, I have put my antennas out in a big way of how can I support other people in our community that are regeneratively growing food, animals or plant-based, whatever. And I would say right now in our market, 9 entities from the James Ranch are represented, even to the point where I have a nephew who's an amazing wood turner. So we don't just carry food. We also have local artisans involved. And so my nephew who makes beautiful wood bowls, he's there. So I'm counting him as one of my 9 from the James Ranch. I have 51, and I'm going to increase that in the next couple of days, probably to 53 other local ranchers, regenerative food producers in our community. That doesn't include the food co-op that I work with, Valley Roots. Matt probably knows Valley Roots out of the San Luis Valley, and our other local food hub, Southwest Food Co-op. They represent other farmers, and I buy through them. And so I'm not even counting those farmers. So there's something extremely exciting happening. And I believe it's going to be, worldwide, because we have to scale down our food production to our local communities and support those families on the land and do it right, so that we can use every little square foot to its highest and best potential. And it's happening. It's really exciting.
Right. Yeah. And I think the thing we haven't really talked about yet, but I'll just sort of bring it up a little bit because it's in the chat. So if you look at the numbers that I talked about before, they were national numbers in terms of agriculture uses 15% of 70% of the water. I think we said, Brad, or something, and we broke that down. I think you did a great job of that. About 50% of the land, in the United States is toward agriculture, a large portion of that for animal agriculture. And energy is kind of interesting. About 15 to 20% of the energy used in the US is for food production or for agriculture. And then that's sort of an interesting number, because one of the questions that this is the prelude to the question is, somebody said, I'm curious about agrovoltaics, and if CSU is planning on expanding education, training, financial assistance around that in the future to integrate energy production and food production while we're protecting soils and reducing water needs. So there's the double-edged sword of energy is at the production end, in terms of agriculture, but of course the transportation issues come into effect, and all that sort of stuff. So I'll just address the agrovoltaics because I sort of just know that that's going on. And if you're not familiar with agrovoltaics, for those of you in the audience, what they're speaking of is the use of solar panels actually over plants or associated with agricultural production. So, you can, like, for example, if you had solar panels high enough for animals to graze underneath them, or you could grow crops under solar panels and harvest those. That's what they're talking about. It's really capturing the efficiency of the sun. And CSU is working closely with Colorado School of Mines, CU, Department of Agriculture, and the state legislature. We've actually had requests for looking at piloting agrovoltaic work. We have solar panels up at a lot of our research centers, but the issue is that they're covering land, right? And so people are saying, well, we're taking that land out of production. Well, in Colorado, the opportunity would be to look at land like rangeland or something. We have a lot of that, and if there was a way to sort of integrate solar technology into the agrovoltaic. So there is a push for that. And then creatively using those in places like the San Luis Valley, where you have pivots, those circles that you see in the ground, and the corners could be used to put solar panels in those things. So anyway, so that's one aspect of to answer that one question, so we can cross that one out. Matt, I was wondering, like, the way you source things, do you worry about that in terms of the energy cost in your business, in terms of, you seem to do local sourcing, but do you have to sort of worry about transportation costs and things with what you're doing?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so one of our big ethos, is native first, local second, right? And so we because we have to spend money, and for part of our mission driven is, if we have to spend money, how can we spend that money in the communities that we represent, right? And so, historically, indigenous foods are dried and preserved, right? There's a whole other side of it, but so sometimes when we have to go get wild rice from Red Lake Nation up in Minnesota, that's a pretty significant travel, right? And there is fossil fuel, and so for us, how do we responsibly do that? If we're gonna put a pallet of wild rice on the back of a UPS truck, then along the pathway down to the restaurant, what are 5 different stops that we can make to then pick up other items that we're going to bring into the restaurant and into the marketplace, right? So really trying to combine those trips so they're just not singular trips. we do. And so, yeah, we definitely have to be responsible on that. As we, with our vision to grow and expand, we have to be really conscious and intentional about our choices of how we expand, because, good, bad, or indifferent, restaurants have a huge impact, right? Just consumption of to-go containers, especially right now with the supply chain being so tight, like not able to get easily recyclable material from a food packaging standpoint. It goes into the waste system, right? And trying to balance that along with a whole other host of issues. So yeah, it's a higher energy equipment. There's a lot of things that we have to contemplate day in and day out of growing, and how do we do it in a way that allows us to thrive, but also is conscious and responsible on the impact that we do have on a day in and day out basis.
Great. Let's circle back to the group. I want to run over you guys, just sort of, we're getting close to the end here. One of the things that, we sort of have to worry about, is this sort of getting too negative about everything. I think, everybody here is very interested in sort of making things work and trying to sort of, we're for the most part, Brad and I are public servants, right? And we sort of really want the state of Colorado to be, a model for agricultural systems and sustainable water use and energy and all that. Maybe I'll start with Brad. Brad, what in a sense, you've been doing this for a while, and I mean, I watched you on 60 Minutes, and that was pretty scary, the stuff you were talking about. I mean, is there any optimism, or can you have any optimism for the future? Is there anything you can really think about that sort of would give you sense, that there's some optimistic things we could be looking towards in addressing these real challenges we have? Yeah.
So the climate scientist Michael Mann has a book out that really focuses on what he calls doomerism, which is this notion that we're all going to hell in a handbasket. So let's all give up.
Right.
And you see it from a lot of different quarters. The chips are down. I will not argue that. I mean, This is a challenge the likes of humanity has never seen.
Yeah.
But there are really good people working on this. Yeah. And I like to think that people will rise to the occasion and figure out how to work together, not separate people, but work together to figure out solutions and to make this planet a better, more enjoyable place. As much of a bummer as COVID has been, there are actually some interesting things have come out of it. Frankly, my slower lifestyle, I'm enjoying it. Not going to the airport and getting on airplanes.
Yeah.
Whoever enjoyed that? That was awful.
Yeah.
And many of the things that we're talking about doing here actually will lead to better lifestyles.
Mm-hmm.
Big changes, mind you, and we need to get everybody on board. You can't kind of split people out and say, "Oh, you're evil and bad." We take everything away from you. That will never work.
No.
So in the water world, what really gives me optimism is that people now, because of bills that were passed in the legislature, know each other. I mean, the greenies know the ag producers, and they understand what they're sensitive to and where the solution set might lie. Yeah. In this state, people talk to each other.
They do.
And that's where the solutions are going to come from.
All right, great, thanks. Nicole, maybe I'll jump up to you in terms of some, you're out boots on the ground out there in one of the driest parts of the state. So give me some optimistic thoughts about how agriculture is going to sort of rebound from all this. Yeah.
Sure, that's easy for me because I'm pretty Pollyanna by nature. But I guess I look at it in two parts. The first is, the solution I was talking about is easy. People buy and sell land every day. So why not buy and protect, 50% or more of the Earth's ecosystems for life-giving ecosystem services.
Yeah.
And I never got back to what Codex came up with for the valuation of our project. If we expand Heartland Ranch to 43,000 acres, Codex analysis indicates that will provide $4 to $8 million worth of biodiversity and climate mitigation services per year. $4 to $8 million. And so I'd really, I'm cheered by what we're doing. It gives me great pleasure to walk on land that's permanently protected, to look at wildlife that's categorically protected, and to know that there are groups and people around the world doing the same thing. And I think it's an all hands on deck effort, and we really need to be putting aside more land for nature. The other thing that gives me optimism is Greta Thunberg. I think that she would be dissatisfied with some of the answers that we've come up with in this discussion. I think she would press us more on emissions from agriculture. I think she would press us more on the carbon market. I think she would press us on the pace at which we are trying to address the climate crisis. And I am optimistic that her and the younger generation are not going to be satisfied with some of these answers, because we know we not only need to act now, we needed to act 3 decades ago. So we had really better step up to all of these challenges. And I like something I think, John, you said, which is always presume you're doing something wrong and monitor to figure out how you can improve. And I think we as a species need to be doing that vis-a-vis the earth.
Right. John and Julie, maybe some comments about, you're living up in heaven up there, up in the mountains. So tell us a little bit about some optimism you have.
Well, I think what I wanted to share was that, like Brad, the pandemic made us all back up a bit and look at our lives. And what we are seeing is that people started to ask really important questions about their food buying choices and their lifestyles. And so when we as a species start asking those kind of good questions, things are going to progress in a good way. I believe. I've been witnessing it every day. People come in and they don't even know what grass-fed and finished beef is. And they'll just say, what is this? And that's a great question. And let's keep asking questions. Where does our food come from? And how does my dollar make a difference in the world and my spending dollar? So we're witnessing that every day. And I love the books that we have in our market. I try to find books that are helping us understand our ecosystems better and how our decisions make a difference. And we're witnessing it all the time. And I also wanted to mention one fun idea that, again, it's just, I think one of our biggest challenges is educating the public. The American public is so used to having really inexpensive food. And so for them to say, wow, I have to spend that much money on a piece of meat, that's an education process. And once they understand what they're doing, then it's a no-brainer, because they are like, wow, that's really nutrient intense, and I'm supporting this and all the things that go into that. And so that's our biggest challenge, is how do we educate people quickly and efficiently. And one quick example is that every Thursday night, the restaurant is doing an event called Gather. And we have 2 guest speakers that are food producers that come and that are part of the dinner. And if you were to buy a ticket, a portion of your ticket goes to gifting that food producer their dinner that night. And that's kind of a fun thing for them, because they are really hard workers. And then also they share their story. So the first night we had some farmers from the Mancos area. They had terrible water this year. They had a grasshopper infestation. They worked really hard and lost a bunch of crops, and they shared their story with this group of people. And it was soul affecting. People really got it. They never heard that kind of thing. They didn't understand how hard it was to raise lettuce. Lettuce is something you just go get at the grocery store. So
dry onions
and the gophers and all the root crops. Gophers are terrible. So when we start to do little things like that in our communities, or we're getting people connected and having each other understand each other's perspective and stories, things are going to change. And that gives me a lot of hope.
Great. And Matt, maybe a bit of optimism.
Yeah, definitely. As Brad, Nicole, and Julie and John have stated, I'm very hopeful because these conversations are happening pretty much every corner of the world and almost in every household. It's front and center day in and day out. So there's really no hiding from this conversation. And there's young and brilliant and creative minds out there that are finding these solutions to negate all the arguments against why renewable technologies are efficient, or they're going to just kill labor, or all these other arguments that get posed on why we shouldn't adopt this technology. And so I'm very hopeful for all those brilliant minds and generations today and the ones that come behind us. I'm also really hopeful that the restaurant industry is seeing how big of an impact they have on multiple different systems, whether it's food systems, whether it's energy systems, and everything in between. And for restaurants to survive and for them to continue to have customers coming, the customers more informed day in and day out, there's going to have to be a fundamental switch, and you're starting to see that across the board. And so, it's a journey, but those changes are happening today and they're going to continue to happen.
That's great. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is kind of the questions we're getting now. How do we better educate individuals about the stuff covered in the webinar? How do we overcome differences in perspectives? Consumers, how do we better provide dialogue between rural and urban communities? And I think that's sort of the essence of what we're doing. We're down here, we're getting these great universities together, these great state and government agencies to work together down in Denver at the Spur campus and other places, and having these conversations, excuse me, at restaurants and at public settings is where we have to dispel the myths and only put facts out. We want people to have the very best science driving policy. And we've got about 30, one more thing I want to finish up on, Kristen, before you take over, is that, a lot of the things I'm asked about, like in terms of, well, what would CSU like to see? Well, we really believe that, research is really important, and we need to keep doing the very best research and getting the very best science behind policy. We need to be able to, expand our conservation programs and make it easier for stakeholders to get involved and access to those. We need to, create safety nets, not only for our producers, but for people. Nobody should go to bed hungry. And and then zero net carbon emissions in terms of doing that. Those are simple things, simple but important things that we should be doing. So anyway, everybody, great job today. One more thing, Kristen, before I get started, let's give a plug. Matt, your restaurants, where are they located? Quickly, tell us where they are.
Yeah, we have two restaurants located. The first one's in North Denver on 44th and Lowell. The second one's down in Greenwood Village, basically Arapahoe and Greenwood Plaza Boulevard. We have a food truck, and you can always find us 24 hours on the web at tocabe.com and shoptocabe.com for our marketplace.
John and Julie, quick plug. Where are you located? People come up and visit you. Yeah.
We're in the southwest corner of the state, Durango, Colorado, 10 miles north.
Okay, great. Nicole, you're down in southeastern Colorado, right? Your place to business, so people can come visit the reserves.
Yeah, people can get in touch with us through southernplains.org. We're in Southeast Colorado. We're in the process right now of expanding our Heartland Ranch Nature Preserve to 70 square miles, and anybody can be a part of that.
All right, Brad, you and I are in the same crib. We're come see us up at CSU or anywhere around the state. So I'll turn it over to Kristen. Thanks.
Thank you all. Gina, I was actually wanting to see if you had a 30-second hopeful thought. You gave us some really thoughtful solutions there, but what's your hope?
Well, I think this is important. The conversations are really important. And I'm more about, I'm optimistic. I think science can usually fix most things. And I think we just need to start to believing in science and trusting the science and making sure that our policies and the way we use land has good science behind it. And that's what I would like to see. And I'd really love to see, I love seeing agriculture in our primary education programs, and a lot of you are already doing that. So I'm optimistic in a sense that, we're talking to each other, and never before have we had these conversations around agriculture and food. I remember 40 years ago, Brad and I are talking about climate change, and that's sort of gone down this road. But we can't afford to do that with agriculture now. We need to get on the ball. And that's what I'm excited about.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panels. This was a great conversation. And I love this idea of gathering, as an actual event is something that we do, because food really is that common factor that can bring people together and can really be that entree point into having those conversations and connecting.
Right.
So a huge thank you to all of you for joining us today in our third and final webinar in this series. It really was impactful. It brought it home. I thoroughly enjoyed all of your points and conversation. Gene, you have one more comment.
Yeah, Kirsten, thanks for doing this. I'm glad the museum is taking this stuff on, and we all want to help. So let us know when you need things and we can do more of these. Okay.
Oh, we will. This is just the start, hopefully. So, and thank you to our audience for joining in today. Huge thank you to our partners at both DU, the Joseph Corbell School, and as well as CSU, both represented here today, as well as the International Agriculture Program. Nicole dropped some links in there. We saw a ton of great resources come through the chat. Our speakers gave us some great resources. We're going to send those out in an email to all of you. And feel free, of course, to pass those along to others that you found that you think would find this interesting, including the link to this recording. So thank you all. Take care, stay safe and healthy, and we hope that you continue the conversation as well.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Bye.